It took me over 6 months to finish the last episode of our podcast. Was it the burnout? Was it the lack of energy that came with it? Or maybe the full emotional atrophy that took over my body as we entered the 3rd year of this brutal full-scale invasion? Whatever it was, gathering thoughts felt almost impossible. Did I even have anything left to say? Was anything I was saying even helping? I'd constantly think to myself. Traveling between London and Ukraine meant that I felt stuck in the in-between, uprooted and indecisive, and this permeated all parts of my life. I knew that I had to pick myself back up, but I also knew that it would take time. Day by day, the realization that we were in this for the long run set in. It no longer felt like we were living through a turning point in our history, but more like on another page from a thick book about centuries of Russian colonial oppression of Ukraine. Perhaps the exhaustion meant that pessimism would win over on most days, but it is precisely that pessimism that would eventually force me to break the cycle of wilting that I was in. Where do we go next? What do we do now? Who do we turn to? I wanted to ask Stas, Marichka and Maksym. This is the last episode of our special season of Ukrainian Spaces, a podcast elevating diverse Ukrainian voices and explaining Ukraine to the world. I don't know why, but going into this conversation, I almost feel like it's some sort of goodbye to something. I feel quite emotional, and also we haven't spoken in a really, really good time. I know that I'm not saying goodbye to my friends. I think it's more about saying goodbye to some sort of feeling that I've had for the past 2 years. And I hope I figure out what it is. But I wanted to also refer back to our first episode that we did in this season. When I listened back to it before this episode, when I was preparing, it was quite nice to remember that, before the full-scale invasion, we all lived in different countries, had different jobs, did different things, had different backgrounds, and somehow we connected. And the good thing is that, whilst all that still is true, we still live in different countries and still do different things and still have different views and, different backgrounds. We are friends now and are still, and I hope will be friends for a long time. And a lot of things have changed, but that has been a constant. And it's been a really tough couple of months, and I wish we all spoke to each other more than we did. But I'm glad that we're able to meet today again and talk online. I hope offline soon as well. But I just wanted to set the scene for all of us before we start and ask you guys about how do you want to frame this conversation? What would you like our audiences who have been listening to us for not just this season, but for a long time, what do you want our audience to go away thinking, feeling, and maybe doing? And also, how do we make sure that what we say today still resonates in 6 months, 12 months, and even maybe years ahead from this moment that we're recording? Who wants to go first?
Just silence.
We haven't done this in a while, that's why. I think, Stas, since you said to just silence, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, I kind of put myself out there. I think that's something that we discussed a little bit before recording, that it's all about trying to manage this whole process, because it turns out that this is like a very long run. And for all of us, it's hard to have our own pace and understand what we can do to be more effective and efficient, and how to apply ourselves for like greater good, for Ukraine's victory. And it's just hard, to keep on doing the ordinary stuff in the long run and also being effective. So I think maybe like where I'm coming into this conversation is, okay, like how can we all help each other be more efficient in this like super long run that we're in?
Yeah, I remember obviously in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, because, it felt so unbelievable and impossible that what was happening. A lot of us thought that it would be over soon. And so we put maximum effort and maximum everything that we had to be able to do just something, even if like a tiny portion, to help stop it quickly. But I think you're right. And even the fact that we're starting by framing this whole conversation about how do we make sure that what we're doing today is relevant for a really long time shows how even my personal perspective has changed on this, and how it is about figuring out long-term strategies for keeping ourselves involved in helping Ukraine and helping not just Ukraine, but everyone understand what it means to still have an imperial power like Russia being a big player in what's happening in the world. But I was wondering if Maksym or Marichka wanted to come in as well.
So how do we want to frame it, right?
And what do we want our audiences to feel and do?
Oh, those are two big questions, great questions, big questions, but separate ones. So the main thing, how I would love to frame it, is a big, huge, fat reminder that we always need to center human stories of real people in when we try to bring attention or describe or inform people about any catastrophic events like these ones. Because I remember that before, when I would read news about wars or catastrophes or conflicts or even genocide somewhere else, usually in the covers there's a lot of very conceptual, dry facts like this is happening there and this X amount of people died and these are the conflict pain points and whatnot. And it just prevents you to see the real tragedy behind it, real people, real stories. And sometimes even if you learn just one story of one person or one family, you kind of understand the whole depth of evilness that is happening. You don't need to know all of those stories. You don't need to know all of those facts. And that's sometimes that we forget, especially because the way the Western or foreign coverage of these events is. So I'd like us to once again remember how it is important to always find a human angle in it and always seek for human stories and testimonies of real people. I think even before genocide in Ukraine started, or even maybe before the Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2014, I would think that even myself, that caring about some injustice happening in the world is enough for you to do this performative action of just posting a post that I stand with XYZ or liking something and then moving on and to another thing, because there's so much in the world is happening. Unfortunately, there's so much injustice and you cannot possibly care about every aspect or every geography, every place where people are suffering. But I've realized now that it's okay to devote your energy to the causes that really deeply touched you. And it's okay sometimes not to be super involved in absolutely every injustice that is happening around you. You know, it's only human. People care and people react to the stories that somehow personally speak to them on some level. And it's just unjust to expect from everyone to be equally invested in all of the tragedies happening around them. And but it's important for you to be meaningfully engaged. And that's kind of the answer for probably the second question. That one of the biggest difference between, for example, places like Russia or, I don't know, China or Iran or any other authoritarian tyrannies, that they always try to teach you that one person doesn't matter. That, you know, it's all a game of big players and big states and geopolitics and all this nonsense. But one person cannot change anything. And you shouldn't even try. But what we've seen in the last 2 years in Ukraine, what we're seeing daily is those extraordinary acts done by ordinary people on a daily basis that actually collectively they make a change. And I often feel like in the free world, in democratic societies, we kind of forget our main superpower. Our main superpower flex is collective action, that those small acts of ordinary people make into one extraordinary story of resistance and change. And it's only this way it can happen. So after, listening to the show, I want people to really remind themselves that no matter how small, their acts of solidarity and compassion, they matter as much, because without them, there's going to be no possibility for collective change whatsoever.
Yeah. And, as much as we don't like sometimes to bring up our own personal stories, I think our own personal stories, and I mean not just the four of us, but so many Ukrainians, those stories, the memory that connects those stories, and the memory that we honor by talking about those stories is also, in a way, a meaningful way for us personally to fight back and to do something to be able to make sure that people don't forget about ordinary people and their destinies throughout so many years and so many centuries. Marichka, what do you think audiences, what would you like audiences that are listening to us to walk away with?
Valeria, this emotion that you began from, about this feeling like you are saying goodbye to something, I feel the same. And while all of you guys were talking, I think I realized and understand why. For me, it's also a feeling like we are saying goodbye to something, and maybe it's that we're saying goodbye to some stage of our activism, of our work, when we finally realize that we are really in a long run, and they're not gonna happen any magic or anything unrealistic. This is all about our strength and possibility to act strategically in this long run. And I remembered also, as many historians and also Timothy Snyder said, that empires and Russian Empire is already ruining itself. But this process can take like 50 years or maybe even 100 years. So this process has already begun, and we are in this process too. But there is so much time and act that we need to do. It's just, I don't know, I think it's impossible to imagine how long we need to fight it. And I think that these words that Maksym said, his final words, it's really important to keep this solidarity and to be together in this. And it's not only about Ukraine, but I realize that there is no world without Ukraine, but it's also no Ukraine without world. And for me, it's important to tell to anybody, especially to foreigners who are not Ukrainians, to keep this solidarity, to stand together, even if they might think that it's kind of small acts, or maybe they don't do enough. In the long run, it's really enough, and it's important. It's just important not to forget, and it's just important not to lose this hope, because as I remember this phrase from the Revolution of Dignity, that we are all small drops, but together we are the ocean. So I think this is an important thought I want to remember for myself, and to tell it and share it with everybody.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I've been feeling this really strange and profound feeling of sadness for the past 4 months, maybe more. And I couldn't explain to myself why it was there, for obvious reasons, of course. And when foreigners talk to you and interact with you, they when you are sad and upset, they assume that it's for one reason. Oh, okay, because there's war. But it's so much more multifaceted and so much deeper. And I only came to the realization of why I had this feeling of sadness. And it was exactly because of this change of perception of our fight, right? It's what we've been talking about for the past however many minutes, of this change from, doing everything in a short period of time to actually doing it for a long time, understanding that we're in this for a really long time. And one thing that I've been talking to someone very wise about this said is that instead of seeing this as a period of, something sad and depressing and something that brings you down. It's actually something that we as Ukrainians and also as foreigners who have been on our side for such a long time, we should see it as a realm of possibilities. It also, this realization and this sadness and this understanding and this new kind of perspective brings with it its own set of possibilities. And I'm not talking about some immediate possibilities, but possibilities for what I think all of us have just been talking about, the possibility of one day, putting in motion what is necessary to make sure that Ukraine is free long term and that it's independent for a really, 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 really long time. And yeah, I think that it's also about switching how we view this state that I feel so many of us are in right now. But it's been more than 2 years. It's been 2.5 years since the start of the full-scale invasion, since we all met each other. And a lot has been done. It's undoubtedly, something that we all feel looking back at this time. What do you guys feel when you think about all the things that Ukrainians, you personally, people around you, civil society, ordinary people have done? What do you feel has been achieved and what do you feel in general? And I'll turn to Maksym with this one first.
So I've been on this parallel journey of learning more about the crimes that Russia has committed through centuries, colonial crimes, and especially, with our Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook, in just to look at the last 100 years on the pattern of colonial invasions that Russia has done. And literally every day, I learn something new because there are so many of these crimes were committed. But one of the things that I did not put into the book at the time when we published it a year ago, but now I know for sure that it's part of the pattern, is how most likely lonely and isolated all those erased voices felt, all those indigenous voices that Russia erased while colonizing new lands. Because part of this textbook formula was also to ensure that you're feeling alone and small and isolated, and you feel like nobody cares about you and nobody will ever help you or even hear your story. That's part of the formula to crush your spirit and crush your resistance. And reading a lot of stories, especially from the first attempt, the latest attempt of Ukraine to gain independence in the beginning of 20th century, you can see all the same patterns, how basically the first Ukrainian Republic fell because there was zero to none care in the world about its existence. And I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is a massive falling apart of this tendency. There's so many countries that support Ukraine now. There's, from arms to solidarity to Ukrainian flags everywhere you go. I've been just to Taiwan and I saw the main street, fully embellished in Ukrainian flags. To just small acts of solidarity that I know that, lots of media like to talk about Ukraine fatigue, but I keep seeing them daily, people donating and sharing the posts online and offline. This has never happened before, at least not for Ukraine, but for most of nations that suffered from Russian colonialism throughout centuries. And I think this is the massive change that I try to keep reminding myself daily and to the people as well. This hasn't happened before. And despite that, it takes too long, as you said, and despite that, every day it's really hard to get demotivated by all this horrific scale of tragedy that is happening. We must also keep remembering that the kind of solidarity and standing up for what is right has also never happened, at least not for Russian victims, ever before.
Thank you. Marichka.
Yeah. There are a lot of things. When I started to think about what exactly we have achieved as Ukrainian society, as government, as people, as activists, I think that there are a lot. There is a huge list of it, and maybe it can be a really good thing to do is to write down everything. Just not to forget and keep reminding that we already achieved so much results that we should be proud of, and to remind ourselves that we are actually succeed and that we are cool. But I'm still fighting my own inferiority complex, because sometimes I think that maybe Ukrainian culture is not that interesting, or maybe why people should learn Ukrainian language. I understand that this is my own problem and I'm in the process of decolonization. So for me, it's the beginning of this decolonization process and understanding all the parts that I have to do about it, and to learn about my culture and to love my culture and language even more, and to respect it. As Maksym already told, I also keep learning a lot information about Ukraine and about Ukrainian government connections with the whole world. For example, today I learned about North Macedonia and how Ukraine helped them 20 years ago, and how North Macedonia helped Ukraine back after the full-scale invasion. It's so many details on so many levels that we still need to learn. But I think that one of the greatest achievements I see through social media and through media, that foreign people not just started to learn Ukrainian language and start interested in Ukrainian culture, but they also come to Ukraine to live there, to visit our cities, to make more tourism, and to show the whole world about Ukraine, because it's not because the war happened to Ukraine, not because of the genocide or something, or invasion, but because Ukraine actually can be cool and interesting to the whole world, as we did with European cities, some years ago.
Stas, what about you?
I just remembered like a funny story I read on Twitter the other week. I think it was written by like a confused Russian person in Europe who heard two Ukrainians speaking to each other in Russian, trying to get directions in the city. And this Russian person sort of stepped in and said in Russian that, well, you should like go straight ahead, turn right, blah, blah, blah. And these two Ukrainian people turned around and said, sorry, we don't speak Russian. And it's such a, I don't know, it's such a clear story of change happening in Ukraine and within Ukrainians. And it's kind of like a bizarre little funny story, but I think this shift of decolonization is happening. And a lot of things, even if they are in transition, they will never go back. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
When I was listening to what all of you were saying in terms of, on a societal level, on a world level, of the changes that have happened because of all the work that has been done, I was thinking of also like on a personal level for me. I think something that I won't lose is like, and something I hope to pass on to, my children and everyone around me, is like the interest in my own family story, and an interest in where I come from and what those who came before me went through, to understand myself better, but to also understand society better. Because we spoke about this so many times before, but, so many of us were living in, kind of in ignorance, and not ignorance, but sort of, ignorance. We've been neglecting all the stories that so many of our, grandparents, parents have been telling us for such a long time, until, for me personally, until recently, until I realized that those were the things that were going to protect my own identity and protect my own understanding of why Ukraine was fighting for its freedom today. Because I realized that it was so deeply rooted in the stories that once as a kid I didn't want to listen to, and that I just, kind of, it went in one ear and went out the other ear. that is something for me. I hope that it's also something that others feel, and I hope that this is exactly one of the results of the work of everybody that has been achieved over the past 2.5 years.
If I may add, I think maybe it's not only about, just learning the stories, or we thought that those stories not cool, but also I clearly remember that when I would like to share stories, or learn more about the stories from my family, whatever it's, that little that of those stories remained, because there's so much silence in our families for various reasons, because of colonization, because of authoritarianism and whatnot. I would also be often shut down, like, for example, by Russians, because unfortunately I have such a rich experience of interacting with Russians, because sharing your indigenous folksy stories, if they're about singing songs or maybe some recipes for food, is fine, because it's cute and unthreatening and folksy. But God forbid you start sharing stories about how entire sections of your family were murdered or deported or disappeared. That becomes, very threatening to them, and becomes like, oh, you're being fascist, or you're being very nationalistic, or, something is wrong with you. So I just remembered that the most prominent voice in studies of Russian colonialism, Dr. Botakovska-Sembekova, she always reminds us that one of the manifestations of a colonized mind, a colonized person, is silence. That you all the time kind of weighs whether you should speak out, whether you should share something, or it's better to just keep your silence and you better be off. And when you guys talk about decolonization in the last 2 years, I think this habit of just speaking out constantly, just not being afraid that you're going to be, ruin everyone's good mood, or you'd feel people uncomfortable by just, sharing something about yourself, about your people, about your family, no matter how uncomfortable it is. You share it because it needs to be heard. And I think this is a pattern that we all successfully have broken, and we're not afraid of speaking out. And I think, despite that the decolonization is not some like end game, end point that you can arrive and you say like, well, I'm now decolonized, their job is done. I think this habit of speaking out, not swallowing your truth, not keeping silent, is the main thing that kind of, sets you on the right course, and kind of makes me feel hopeful that everything eventually will be okay if I keep that track.
Sometimes in a period of feeling hopeless, I remember one thing, that Russia actually wanted us to remain silent, to shut up, to feel hopeless. And this thought gives me more strength and even ideas. What should I do more, and how should I act more? Because there are so many things that we haven't told yet, and there are so many things that we should do together. And when Maksym told that we already achieved this opportunity not to fear, speak out loud, but sometimes in the period of, tiresome or maybe bad mood, I think that maybe it's not interesting that much to talk about Ukraine anymore for the world, and maybe nobody even cares. But then I remember, okay, please stop, because that's actually what Russia wants you to do. So we shouldn't shut up, like, never.
I wanted to ask perhaps Stas, looking back again to before the full-scale invasion, maybe a little bit after it, a little bit before, but what do you feel like you know today that you didn't know 2 years ago? And that can be about yourself or in general society.
I think there's too much, too much stuff that I learned in these 2.5 years to put them into one answer. I definitely, we were talking in this season about living through history of Ukraine and of its modern history. And when the full-scale invasion began, we were definitely all feeling that we are living through this massive historical event. But one of the things that I never realized until pretty recently is that when you live through history, there's no, like, history doesn't end at some point. You don't just get to live through it and then go back to your life out of history, doing your stuff. It always keeps happening, keeps going, and I think like the thing that I'm still trying to learn is how to keep living with this sort of sense that we are all part of history. We should all be the change that we are advocating. Yeah, that's probably the hardest part. But at the same time, I learned so many cool people, you guys included, of course. I got to know a lot of interesting voices and perspectives, and just generally, it's sort of opened a lot of stuff about me, my family as well. Valeria, you talked about, turning back to your family story, not listening when you were a kid. I think I had a very similar kind of journey myself. But yeah, I think it's pretty hard to pin down because it's such a turnaround event that you look differently at yourself, at the people around you, at the social, political, historical context that you have been living in. I think it's maybe it's a cliche to say that this is an ongoing journey, but it is. It opened many doors, and I don't think they're going to get closed soon, most of them.
Yeah. Marichka, how do you feel? What do you know today that you didn't know when everything, well, not everything started, but full-scale invasion started?
Maybe there are a few things that I want to point out. One thing that I've never thought that Ukraine can be such a huge part of all the political, geopolitical, economical process in the world on many levels. But I think that you understand what I'm saying about. And it's also, for me, was very interesting to know a lot of these connections through the history, because as a kid, I learned that Ukraine wasn't that huge an important country. Nobody actually looked at us. But now I realize that everything has changed, and thanks to our achievements as people, as a society. But also, I think that I never thought about myself that I can be so proactive and creative and to be in such a long run also. Because if somebody told me 3 years ago that I can make so much activism online and to meet so many cool people, and there are actually in the world so many cool and kind people, I think that I wouldn't believed in it, honestly, because always I thought that the world is evil, everything is unfair, and it still feels like sometimes that the world is unfair, but there are also a lot of kindness in the world, and it gives me more support and feeling hopeful. I think that it's also about my inferiority complex that I already mentioned about, because for me, Ukraine wasn't such interesting thing. I was interested to live in Europe, in European Union, somewhere else. But then I realized after the full-scale invasion that the whole world system that was built after the Second World War actually it doesn't work. And now we are at the new stage of building something new that actually can fight this injustice in the world, maybe to build more fair system for people from different countries, from South, from Eastern countries. It's very important. So, yeah, I think that, the everything that I believed before, it didn't work for me. So now we are in the process of creating something new.
Yeah. And, we started this with Maksym 2 years ago with our first episode of Ukrainian Spaces. Didn't know each other, met online. I feel like I repeat this every time when we talk about the first few weeks of the full-scale invasion. But back then, I feel like I was definitely a different person. And I feel like from all the interviews and all the amazing people that we met throughout all the seasons of Ukrainian Spaces, there was a lot that I was able to pick up and learn as a person myself. And it did change my perspective on not just the world, but my own identity and how I understood myself, which I think was something that I didn't expect was going to happen, even though that sounds ridiculous today. But Maksym, how do you feel about the change, if there was any, from back then to today?
In terms of our own self-reflection, I think little has changed because we started with this specific idea to showcase to the rest of you how beautifully diverse and different Ukrainianness is. That you can meet so many different people, different ethnicities, nationalities, skin colors, professions, whatnot. And they're all share this one belonging to Ukrainian identity. They all find home there. So probably the biggest difference from there is that now I'm more certain and can share bazillion stories to people to showcase it and explain it. And I met so many different and diverse and beautiful Ukrainians along the way. We did it together, right? And we now are friends with so many, including Stas and Marichka here. What has probably changed happened outside of a Ukrainianness. And when I saw so many of my friends who are far, far away and removed from Ukrainian context, and who have been profoundly changed by what is happening in Ukraine. Like, traditionally, I was in these circles of many people who are usually labeled abroad in the West as so-called progressive people. Left-leaning, those who believe in social justice and very involved in changing the world around them. But we all know that when the genocide in Ukraine started, there was suddenly massive rift between people who would call themselves progressive and stand for social justice in rich societies, would not really feel really empathetic or kind of care a lot about what is happening in Ukraine or the Ukrainians. And suddenly lots of double standards would appear, right? That they would manifest solidarity to some cause, but some genocide, but constantly, repeatedly ignore and silence Ukrainians. But some of these people were my friends. Some of them haven't changed, but lots did change. One of my friends, for example, I remember then when the Maidan revolution started and Ukrainians started toppling first Soviet monuments of Lenin or other horrific personalities, Russian personalities that were dotted in our cities on each corner. And I remember there was like a decommunization process and lots of stuff were thrown out of some official building, including like these small busts of Lenin, miniature ones. And I picked up one and I know like, okay, I have this, friend who's very close friend who's Western communist. I'm going to send him this, Lenin bust, just like LOL moment. And we kind of laughed and he said like, oh, this is amazing present. But now, so many years later, he's saying, I was so dumb. That was so stupid. This is the same as, I don't know, exchanging busts of Hitler's. Why would I ever think that this is an okay thing to do? And why would I think that featuring it in my home, it would be like appropriate thing to do? This is dumb and disgusting. And I'm really ashamed of the person I used to be and the views I held. And that kind of reminded me that the power of change. And this is a good moment, not only for Ukrainians to maybe figure out things about themselves, but once again, the reason why so many foreigners coming back to us and love being around us, because they see how many Ukrainians profoundly changing. And then, even if you held shitty views or you had inferiority complexes or your worldview was really messed up, it can change. and they change with us. And I find it the most inspiring, beautiful daily. Just love seeing that daily. That's really a gift.
I'm going to finish with one final question to all of you. For multiple seasons, Maksym and I have been, this is a joke, torturing people with one question at the end of every episode. And well, we were always nice and asked people to sort of think about it ahead of time. But I wanted to finish this episode by asking each of you what it means to be Ukrainian for you today. And I hope that it's okay that I will start and call on Marichka to begin this.
The first characteristics that occurred to my mind when you asked me, I think it was very specific Black humor as a coping mechanism to everything. And also kind of self-criticism and irony that I have about everything and everywhere, even that I'm trying to feel positive, optimistic. But for me, it's always, to start from the criticism and then to support it and to make it work. And I think it's a very Ukrainian thing to do when Ukrainians just begin from the criticism, but then they realize that it actually can work. So I think it's just a part of my identity. And I think that I'm proud of it because it's kind of the way to exist and to work through. But I don't know. Tell me, what do you think? Because for me, it's a very complex question. It's about identity. It's about the way of behaving to people. It's the way of thinking about the world and Ukraine in this world. So I'm really interested to hear out your thoughts, guys.
I think it's also what you just said is part of, I guess, my answer, which is that like being Ukrainian is so multifaceted and can be, used to describe so many things and understand so many things, which is why I think that was always a question we asked people, because it was so interesting to hear all the different answers that all the different people we interviewed had. And yet there was something that was sort of, a thread throughout the answers that people gave that still made it possible to define it as being Ukrainian, which I thought was quite beautiful and fascinating, because it's like, kind of the beauty and the diverse answers that people had and in their own understanding of being Ukrainian. And I think for me, and again, it's once again bringing back to why we started this particular season and how we did it of Ukrainian Spaces, but also what we spoke about recently and also the stories that I heard from you over the past episodes that we recorded, is that there's something that being Ukrainian means that there's something that connects you and unites you with others into a common kind of effort to achieve freedom, right? In whatever way it is, in whatever sense it is, in your daily life, in a civil society level, in a local level, whatever it is, it's about making those connections, not always agreeing, disagreeing a lot of the time, but finding a way to connect, to be able to drive, our country, our society, and everyone else forward. And also, I think that would be impossible if, referring back to what both, I think, Marichka and Maksym were saying, is that if we didn't speak out. I think for me, being Ukrainian is having the bravery to be able to say things that may not always, say things loud and try, and even if people don't listen sometimes, and we've all come across that, and I would say more so recently than before that, but it's the ability to keep speaking even though it sometimes feels like not as many people are listening. And that is something that for me is a defining characteristic of being Ukrainian. But Stas, what do you think?
Yeah. I think for me, so I think in the first year following the full-scale invasion, I kind of looked back a lot. So I looked into the story of my family. I looked into, like, I read a lot of history of Ukraine, of Kyiv. I dig some, records, trying to, understand my roots better. And it felt like this very liberating act to, to get myself, to know myself better, and to understand where I'm coming from. But I noticed recently that I sort of stopped doing that recently. And I'm thinking more and more about the future now. And I'm thinking, how do I, knowing all this legacy, knowing all this story that I carry now, how do I carry it further? And how do I, succeed in life? How do I build meaningful relationships, surround myself? It's kind of, it's just, I hope it's a natural process, and I hope it's a meaningful process to sort of transition from simply looking back and understanding yourself to finding application of this understanding in the future, in the present. I think I never reflected on this thing, and I only realized it in the last month or so.
Thank you, Stas, for sharing that. And I think it's quite nice that we will end on me asking the question, the same question to Maksym. But Maksym, what does it mean to be Ukrainian for you today?
Ukraine can only survive if everyone else's helps stands in solidarity with Ukraine, because no way, with such a different amount of powers, facing such a massive empire with almost unlimited resources, you cannot just stand on just bravery and, your beautiful self. But we're recording this during the Olympics. So I'm usually not into sports, but whatever the International Olympic Committee says, sports is all about politics, especially for nations that survived colonization. We know that just being proud of who we are, just manifesting authentic selves is already an act of political resistance. Just being, for us, is already political. So I'm sharing lots of these clips of Ukrainian Olympians or, other Olympians from former Russian colonies like Kazakhs or Moldovans. And there was a moment when one Ukrainian prominent Olympian, Dilshot Khalmatov, he, after winning, he's a champion in judo, and after winning after his rival judoka from Uzbekistan, it was such a heartwarming moment. It was very nasty fight, very intense. But then he came to the person he won over. He comforted him, hugged him, and said some, encouraging words, despite that person was really, really, heartbroken by his loss. And I posted that on Twitter, and some people came, starting writing, well, maybe that's not Ukrainian kindness, not Ukrainian character, but the fact that, that person that Khalmatov won over and Khalmatov have Uzbek ethnicity, maybe that played the role. And it got me so infuriated. So I started posting other examples, not only of Khalmatov comforting other Olympians in other athletes in other situations, but also other Ukrainian Olympians also flexing this kindness and grace after they won, kind of making the point that this kindness and perseverance is something that is a Ukrainian thing, that kind of makes this basis for Ukrainian diversity, where people of different backgrounds still can find their very natural home in being Ukrainians, no matter how they look, no matter where they come from, or whichever their background. So I know that's not a regional answer, but coming back to diversity, this is everything for Ukrainians. And I'm really glad that we were able to feature all of it in such a huge spectrum over these seasons of Ukrainian Spaces.
This is it. You finished listening to Season 4 of Ukrainian Spaces. We are grateful to all of you for your support and help, because we couldn't have done this without you. And I hope that listening to our personal stories and what made us connect will really give you an ability to understand more about Ukraine and more about our country's history, but also our country's present. For us, it took a while to record this season because not only was it of a different format, it also required us to look deep within ourselves, within our stories, within our memories, within memories of our families. And this wasn't an easy thing to do, as we were living every day through something that changed our lives forever and the lives of those in Ukraine forever on a scale that is very hard to imagine. But doing this, I think, helped us not only understand more about ourselves, but also go through some of those dark and depressing moments in our lives as well. Because even listening back at these episodes, even writing the scripts for these episodes and working with the team on these episodes made us take a step back and gave us a moment to pause and listen to ourselves. The one message that I have for you at the end is that remember one thing: listen to Ukrainian voices and their stories, because that is the only way you can truly learn about Ukraine, the country that is currently fighting off an invading colonial force. I want to wish everyone to stay strong and to keep being interested in the stories of others, because that is also how we learn more about ourselves. Thank you to everyone who listened, and thank you to everyone who supported and donated for this to have been possible.